Bobby Fischer's most brutal final checkmating combination to win against this international master. It involves sacrificing 2 rooks and a queen. Let's go. Martiner begins by playing d4, and Bobby responds with knight f6, controlling the center. White plays c4, establishing a strong center, and here g6 is played, looking to fianchetto the bishop on g7 and control the long diagonal. White continues by pushing their pawn to e4, and after a couple of moves you can tell what is going on. White is obtaining the entire center with pawns, meanwhile black is focusing on quick development and getting a safe and castled king. However, white continues here by pushing their pawn forward with e5 using their strong center. This was a little bit too much, because after the knight retreats, it turns out that the center looks strong, but is very, very weak, and black can chip away at the center by means of f6, d6, and c5. You'll see this happen momentarily. We start with d6, and then Bobby Fischer plays c5 on the very next move, chipping away at white's center. Okay, now in this position, white takes the pawn on c5, noticing that black cannot take back because of the pin of the queens. So what did Bobby Fischer have in mind? Well, he simply ignores the pawn and develops a piece with knight to c6. White decides, let's take another pawn, and they take the pawn on d6. Now, Bobby Fischer, in the end of these moves, is down material. So what is Bobby Fischer doing? Well, clearly what he's trying to do is sacrifice 1 pawn in exchange to activate all of his pieces and chip away at the center. So for example, in this position, if black were to take the pawn on d6, they would have to contend with bishop takes the knight on c3. And in the end of these trades, you can see that it is the white pawn structure that is in complete ruins. And so let's take a step back. What did white do instead? They moved their knight, activating it into the center, but this turned out to be a fatal mistake. They should have instead developed another piece, either moving the knight to e2 or moving the knight to f3. Guys, this is a simple principle. You want to develop more pieces into the game instead of moving the exact same knight again and again. And so Martiner is already playing quite suboptimally, and Bobby Fischer is going to take advantage of this very, very shortly. He begins by developing his bishop to f5, hitting the knight in the center. Now, the knight could have taken on the pawn on d6, but then, again, the bishop on g7 will become very active. After knight takes d6, let's say that queen takes d6 is played. If pawn takes d6, then again the bishop is active, and if queen takes, you can simply sidestep with your queen, opening up the square on d8 for the rook to come, attacking the queen. You get a lot of initiative. So after bishop f5, this is why white played knight to g3 instead, attacking the bishop, forcing it to retreat. Okay, here, finally, white decides, let's develop some pieces into the game, and they play knight f3, but Bobby Fischer already has a pretty dominant position, and he continues in this position by playing queen to c7, looking to again free the square for the rook to come and infiltrate, and also looking to unpin the queens, and therefore threatening to take in the center. The game continues with queen coming all the way to the corner of the board. The idea, I think, is to run away from the open d-file, which again is where a lot of the action is happening. I should say that if in this position white were to take the pawn in the center, once again this would open up the bishop, and that is something that white always has to contend with, and so moving the queen to the corner also has the benefit of defending the weak square on b2, and therefore allowing maybe in the future for this pawn to move. Okay, the game continued in this position with black taking the pawn in the center, and instead of recapturing, white plays f5, attacking the bishop and attacking the pawn on g6. Now this is getting very, very messy. The idea is that if you were to take the pawn on f5, you are ruining and opening up your structure, and therefore Bobby Fischer instead pushes the pawn to e4, opening up the bishop and putting some pressure on b2. Now a series of trades commences. You have white taking the bishop and black taking the knight, and in the end material is fairly equal, but there's a couple of important details to point out. First of all, after white takes back the pawn on f3, this was the response that Bobby Fischer had in mind, f5. This is a critical move. You are trying to freeze the center, you're threatening to play f4, forking and winning a piece. I should say that if you were to instead take the pawn, the rook opens up, but this pawn is weak, and you don't actually have that many opportunities. Instead, playing f5, you're threatening the fork. Now you might be wondering, wait a minute, can't white simply play f4 and stop the fork? And that is true, but look at the squares that this move has weakened, and Bobby Fischer intended, and on the very next move, tries to occupy those squares. Additionally, the pawn on e6 does not need to be taken instantly, it will fall very shortly. There's no way for white to defend it. Okay, so Bobby Fischer is beginning to activate his pieces. the pawn structure in the center is beginning to clarify as well, and it is black who clearly has the initiative. In fact, the engine already thinks that black is close to winning. Now in this position, white probably should have castled, but they were worried that after rook takes e6, the bishops begin to fall. So instead of castling, white played king to f2, defending the bishop, and after rook takes e6, they no longer need to spend a tempo keeping that bishop safe. But the rook is still very active on the e-file, and soon the other rook will come and work together with the rook on e6, and the e-file is clearly the area of the board that black is controlling. Now the game continued with a rook to e1, looking to meet the doubled rooks by moving the bishop to f3, defending the bishop on e3. However, in this position, a spectacular and magnificent combination, one of the most iconic moments of Bobby Fischer's career, begins. Ladies and gentlemen, in this position, Bobby Fischer sacrifices the rook, then sacrifices the other rook, and then sacrifices the queen right into checkmate. I'm going to play that one back because it is unbelievable. You give away the rook for the exchange, you then trade off the rooks on e3, and then you take the pawn on f4 with your queen, giving away the queen for nothing more than a pawn. But the point is that after white takes it, Martner was in for a little treat with bishop h6. Game over. Now, can white refuse the trade? It is possible. White can simply move the king to f2, for example, but that won't save them for long. The knight is simply going to begin to infiltrate knight to g4. It is coming to e3. The other knight is coming to d4. The bishop's hanging mate is coming. Game over. Ladies and gentlemen, Bobby Fischer crushes this international opponent with some spectacular sacrifices. I hope that you enjoyed that video. Let me know if you did. Let me know if you have questions about the game. And I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.